Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Iran. The Iranian nuclear threat threatens the world. Most particularly, the Iranian nuclear threat threatens Israel. It is deeply concerning. One of the questions most asked of me is, when will Israel attack Iran? The question behind the question is obvious. Israel will be in the crosshairs of a nuclear-armed Iran. That threat is unacceptable. That threat is undeniable. What point for Israel is the point of no return? After a hiatus that has run much too long, the nuclear talks between Iran and the P5+1 are scheduled to resume in Vienna on November 29th. This information comes from Ali Bagheri Khani, Iran's chief nuclear negotiator. It was released by way of a tweet. It read, in a phone call with Enrique Mora, we agreed to start negotiations aiming at the removal of the unlawful and inhumane sanctions on November 29th in Vienna. Enrique Mora is the European envoy for the talks. The end result of these talks is almost beside the point. Iran wants to do it. They want negotiations. They want bargaining points. They are all about an Iranian smokescreen. Iran wants nuclear weapons. Unless there is a seismic shift in the Iranian politic, one way or the other, this year or in the next few years, they will achieve their goal. Once Iran has nuclear capabilities, it will be too late. Too late for Israel, too late for the Western world. But Israel needs to address several important issues before striking at Iran's nuclear facilities. The Israeli military establishment has multi-dimensional weapons, many of which would be aptly used in an attack. Israel needs to determine exactly which of these weapons would be most effective. In making that decision, Israel needs to determine whether they want to set back Iran's nuclear project or destroy it. An obvious option is using a conventional weapon and conducting a conventional strike against Iran's nuclear facilities. This would be in the model of Israel's 1981 raid on Osirak, Iraq's nuclear facility. While that raid was a success, today it would be an even more daring and dangerous operation. And while a coordinated multi-target strike on Iran's nuclear sites by Israeli planes and missiles is a possibility, it is neither the first option nor the safest. It is the safest neither for the Israeli pilots or for Iranian people on the ground. It has real risks, and it does not have the highest level of potential success. The best option of all, right now, has been used already to curtail Iranian nuclear development. What is that? A hack, cyber warfare. Yes, the future of warfare in general. Fewer people will be hurt in a cyber attack using computer hacking than a conventional warfare attack. Israel has several times already launched cyber attacks against Iran's nuclear development system. Each and every one has been very effective. And as Iran advances their nuclear work, I expect that they will be struck again by a sophisticated cyber hack, which will, in all probability, be similar to the malicious computer worm Stuxnet that was discovered in 2010 by Iran after it had invaded its nuclear network. Stuxnet was just one attack. There were other cyber attacks that followed. The most recent hack, by the way, crippled Iran and turned ordinary Iranians into raging protesters and involved shutting down all the gasoline stations, all of them across the country. For several days, let's say, people could not fill up their gas in their cars. Iranians were livid. Israel needs to set back Iran's nuclear plans several years. That kind of hack will need to be extremely broad-based. It will require attacking multiple aspects of the Iranian nuclear system. For the traditionalists, the cyber attack does not seem effective. They would argue that nothing is better than an airstrike with bunker buster bombs hitting a full array of targets throughout Iran. Shock and awe, they would say. But the times, they are changing, and the traditional way might not be the best way to strike Iran, not to mention that it would, without a question, leave Israel open for a counterattack by Iran, and Israel would need to be certain that they could repel the counter-strike that would, without a doubt, be directed at civilian targets. As much as Israel cares about their soldiers, Israel cares even more about their citizens and their civilians. Israel needs absolute self-assurance that its citizens are safe from that kind of a counterattack, whether it's carried out directly by Iran or if it comes from strikes from Iran's proxies, like in Lebanon and Syria. For their part, Iran is goading Israel, hoping that Jerusalem will launch a conventional strike against them. They're waiting and planning. And the plan is to counterattack by launching rockets not only from Iran, but from Syria and Lebanon, as I mentioned. And they will be a full array of weapons, short range, long range, guided, unguided. Iran is just waiting for this opportunity. And that's why Iran has stockpiled well over 150,000 missiles and rockets in Hezbollah weapons caches in Lebanon and Syria. Even with Israel's famed Iron Dome defense system, it would be very difficult to intercept all of these rockets. So what and when will it happen? I can't give you an answer. Will it destroy the system or send it back? Not sure either. But how will it happen? I'm expecting a cyber attack. I won't be surprised if it happens sometime very soon. Coming up next, points of view. First up is a column from the Daily Saba. Daily Saba, we've used a few times. It's Turkey's English language paper online. The column is entitled, How Can Israel Be a Good Neighbor? It was published on October 25th, 2021, and is written by Haki Okal. I want to look at this column because it lends insight into Turkish understanding of the region and underscores, of course, Turkey's tremendous disdain for Greece, the United States, and to a lesser degree, their disdain for Israel also. Okal begins, It's no wonder that every holy book emanating from the sons and daughters of Abraham unites righteousness and charity in the word tzedakah. The Jews call it tzedek, is how we say it in Arabic. The Torah poses the question, who is rich? Answering, he who is happy with what he has. Unfortunately, Okal is incorrect. The Torah does not say this at all. It is rather a quote from the Mishnah in Avot. It is a rabbinic idea, not a Torah idea at all. Okal continues, this is not your weekly sermon, but one cannot help but think back to high school comparative ethics classes when reading about the power games being played at the east end of the Mediterranean. Now Okal turns to Halpern, an international corporation, and he writes, the issue is once again Israel's oil and gas explorations and Lebanon's pleas that they stop. Lebanon's cabinet asked the United Nations permanent representative to stop Tel Aviv after it granted the U.S. Halliburton Company an offshore drilling contract in the Mediterranean. Those areas are clearly beyond Israel's exclusive economic zone. Israel already pumps gas from huge offshore fields disputed by Lebanon. Halliburton will collaborate with the Greek energy producer Energean in drilling 5 wells in the north of Karish natural gas field. 3 years ago, a Greek company discovered a significant reserve of natural gas off Israel's coast. The only problem was that those areas lie outside the legitimate zones where Israel can safely drill. According to preliminary estimates, the latest discovery in the area amounts to between 28 billion cubic meters and 42 billion cubic meters of natural gas. The drilling zone granted to Halliburton through the contract is expected to contain 32 billion cubic meters of gas reserves, according to the Greeks. The author and the Turks, as a whole, are very upset at the Greeks and the United States and Israel for tapping into natural gas reserves in the Mediterranean Sea. Lebanon is upset. Turkey is arguing the Lebanon case. Now the columnist comes to his conclusion, and he again misidentifies his source. This time, the quote is from Mishlei, from Proverbs. And while, yes, it is in the Bible, it is not a Torah portion of the Bible at all. It is in the writing section of the Bible. Okal writes, strangled is the voice of common sense in this shouting match about drilling rights. Usually the weather does not get very cold in Lebanon, yet the country imports gas all the way from Italy, Russia, and Kuwait. Instead of engaging in power politics, Israel could act as a good neighbor and sit down to a negotiation table with not only Lebanon, but also with Palestinians in Egypt. The Torah continues answering the question it posited, stating, happy is he who met a valiant woman. She is infinitely more precious than pearls, because she knows the Hebrew meaning of generosity. In giving, we receive. This is a classic example of Turkish propaganda, masquerading as analysis and journalism. Next up is a column written by Gilead Ini. The column is from Israel National News, and it was reprinted from the media watchdog group Camera. Ini is a senior research analyst at Camera. The piece appeared on November 5th, 2021, and it is a counterpoint to the New York Times piece, in which the New York Times reported photographer traveled throughout Israel to find only frustrated and angry Israelis. Eni rejects the entire premise. He refutes every argument in the New York Times piece. Eni says the Israelis are happy. The column is entitled New York Times Comical Account of What It Means to Be an Israeli. Subtitled, a New York Times reporter and photographer go into car. They travel across one of the world's happiest countries only to find anger, alienation, and regret. Israelis find that really funny. Op-ed. This is how the column begins. New York Times coverage of Israel, its efforts to curate, conceal, and contrive the faraway land for its American readers has descended into hilarity. Indeed, a recent front-page story by the Jerusalem bureau chief, Patrick Kingsley, which promises to help readers discover what it means to be Israeli today, is a comical caricature of the paper's own biases, exposing much more about the New York Times than about the country it's supposedly covering. To understand why, it helps first understand a couple of facts about that country. Israel is consistently ranked at the top of measures of global happiness. 2021 World Happiness Report, for example, found Israelis to be among the happiest in the world, ranked their country as 12th happiest out of 149 countries over the past 3 years. Eni gives example after example disproving the findings of the New York Times. Then he concludes, but this is over the top in a country whose history of conflict makes all the more remarkable its resilience, vibrancy, and happiness. The New York Times, whose reputation of anti-Israel advocacy has grown in recent years, bends itself out of shape to curate malcontent. It isn't following where the Israeli roads lead, letting chance encounters eventually paint an accurate picture. Rather, it's flipping two-headed coin to get the intended result. The cheating is apparent to those familiar with the country. It looks desperate. The desperation is clumsy, and clumsiness is funny. But it's also sad, because the newspaper's reporting isn't meant to be funny. So the joke is on readers. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you several cartoons and videos today. They all come to us courtesy of the Palestinian Media Watch. More specifically, Palestinian Media Watch found all of these cartoons and videos on official Palestinian media and is disseminating them for the world to see. And that way, hopefully, the world will begin to understand the Palestinian mindset and true intentions for Israel in their perspective. The theme in each and every video and cartoon we will be looking at is that Israelis, particularly the IDF, the Israeli army, are using COVID against the Palestinians. One example uses religious sites, another uses children, another uses prisoners. The entire idea is insidious. Official PA media promotes the conspiracy theory that the IDF and Israelis are spreading COVID.
الجنة العياد لذينة يا عالمي أرضي محروقة أرضي حرية مسروقة سمانا عم تحلم وبتسأل الأيام وين الشمس الحلوة ورفوف الحمام يا عالم أرضي محروقة أرضي حرية مسروقة أرض الصغيرة مثل الصغيرة ادونا السلام وعطونا الطفولة أعطونا السلام.
To us, this message is absurd. To many Palestinians, especially haters of Israel, this is ammunition. It is fodder. It's fodder for their hatred. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Iran announced that they have successfully enriched 77 pounds of uranium to 60% purity. There's no reason to question the veracity of their announcement. Although Iran often lies and exaggerates, in this case, the announcement reflects a reality that is more plausible. The announcement comes on the eve of renewed talks to take place in Vienna between Iran and the P5+1. The West, especially the United States, hopes that this round of talks will result in a return to the famous Iranian nuke deal that President Trump pulled out of in 2018. Here's the problem, and it is a very reasonable issue. Iran's uranium announcement probably is truthful. It is very hard to walk back scientific technology. That's the problem. Iran has the capability of enriching 60% uranium. They are not going to go back to 3.65, which is stipulated in the agreement. This is an exact quote from Behrouz Kamalvani, spokesperson for the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran. So far, we have produced 25 kilograms of 60% uranium, which, except for countries with nuclear weapons, no other country is able to produce. I would say the P5+1 are walking straight into an Iranian diplomatic trap.
After 30 days of unsuccessfully trying to get the American hostages out of Tehran, the government of the United States is now trying to get the deposed Shah of Iran out of this country.
On November 4th, 1979, Iran stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran. The kidnapping and hostage crisis, as it was dubbed by the media, lasted 444 days. It was 42 years ago. Rallies took place all over 800 Iranian cities to celebrate this strike against the enemy, their nemesis, the United States of America.
The government of Iran must recognize the gravity of the situation which it has itself created and the grave consequences which will result if harm comes to any of the hostages.
These rallies are traditional in Iran. The establishment embraces attacks against the West, especially attacks against the United States. So, in each of these coordinated and choreographed rallies across Iran, huge U.S. flags were laid on the ground and participants marched over them. They were, in essence, trampling on the United States. But that was not enough. U.S. flags were also set on fire and left to burn along the parade routes. The rallies and the parade have become an annual event in Iran. It is a celebratory event. Last year, the celebrations were canceled because of COVID. This year, they are back. This is just another example of how consumed Iranian leadership is with their battle against the United States. Iran's chief rabbi, Rabbi Gerami, paid a visit to the United States. Rabbi Gerami was received with mixed emotions and mixed greetings. While many Persian Jews living in Brooklyn and in LA were livid and extremely upset that Gerami was visiting their Jewish communities, others invited him in and received him like a hero. The Chabad Conference of Shluchim, Chabad emissaries from communities around the U.S. and around the world, danced around him. He was invited into their schools and met with their students. But there was a significant dissent from the general Jewish community. Gerami is a frequent Israel basher in both the international press and the Iranian media. Even worse was his condolence visit to the family of Qassam Soleimani after Soleimani was assassinated by the United States in January 2020. To jog your memory, Soleimani was the commander of the Al-Quds force of the Revolutionary Guard. He was the mastermind behind almost every significant attack perpetrated on Western targets outside of Iran. Gerami has to make what I call the choiceless choice. His home and his rabbinate are in Iran. He needs to bow to Iranian Shiite leadership to protect himself and his community. He needs to say and do things that are totally against what we would think to be correct. We, who do not live under that oppression, cannot possibly imagine what it is like. The closest historical example and parallel to Gerami's predicament is the Judenrate, the Jewish leaders who ran the ghettos during the Holocaust. I was surprised to hear the former Intel Minister of Saudi Arabia, Prince Turki AlFaisal, publicly critique the United States and U.S. policy in the Middle East. Prince's critique was not private or off the record. It was critique intended for insiders. No, his remarks were made at a public event at the Atlantic Council. Prince Turki AlFaisal said the United States' influence in the Middle East was stuck in strategic confusion. He said the United States was the dominant power for the last 7 decades. Therefore, doubts about its role and commitments to preserve regional security are accumulating and resulting in a continued strategic regional confusion, which leads to more conflicts and crises. No region in the world fears the danger of this strategic confusion more than the Middle East, he says. I fear that the prince is correct. The confusion displayed by the United States in their foreign affairs decisions is causing tremendous global uncertainty, particularly in the Middle East. That uncertainty will translate into empowering the dark forces of the Middle East, forces that for decades have been held at bay by the United States, but no more. When 25,000 leaders from around the world descended on Glasgow, Scotland, to fight for the future of the earth and gathered to combat climate change, there were some really serious issues that organizers should have foreseen and did not. There was a significant blowback for that. For example, because many of the participants flew in on private aircraft, organizers should have called on everyone to fly on commercial airlines. They should have been encouraged to save energy, even if only as a symbol. Even if people disregarded the directive and flew their own Learjet, the conference would have been on the record at least. Conference organizers could have also asked major players to charter large aircraft and invite other participants to join them. Again, this is a symbol, it's a gesture, it's an important one. This next example, though, is inexcusable. In the year 2021, at a conference claiming to save the world, the conference center was not accessible to the disabled. Israeli Minister of National Infrastructure and Water, Karine El-Harar, who suffers from muscular dystrophy, has a very special wheelchair. On day one of the conference, despite having notified organizers of her special needs way in advance of the event, the minister in the government of Israel spent 2 hours trying to find a way to enter the conference center. She went to 3 different entrances, and then she called for a shuttle to pick her up. And to add insult to injury, that too, the shuttle was not accessible. She tweeted, "I went to the International Climate Conference to promote the joint struggle in the climate crisis through meetings with my counterparts around the world. Unfortunately, that was not possible because of accessibility problems that have no justification in the year 2021. By the next day, the situation was rectified. But actions do speak louder than words." Israel engaged in a 2-day all-out military drill on their northern border using reservists of the 36th Division, also known as Gash. Included in this drill were non-combative elements, like the speed of the call-up and the agility required to move into formation and move into defense or attack mode way up north. The drill began with everyone either getting a message or a text message or a phone call to their cell phone. Each member of the division got it, and they were told where to go and given their first instructions. The goal of the drill was to test readiness, to make certain that the reserve soldiers can be efficiently called up and placed into position. The drill was obviously also a message to Iran, to Hezbollah, and to Syria. Israel is sending a message to their enemies. Reservists, professional and mature veterans of the IDF, are at the ready and fully prepared for any and all conflicts. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that all laws in Judaism are not equal? The principle is very simple, actually. There is a hierarchy of Jewish law. Laws from the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, have the highest level of import in Judaism. They were given by God to Moses directly. In the Aramaic, these laws are referred to as midoraita, mitzvot midoraita, which means commandments given from the Torah. Next are the laws from the portions of the Bible known as the prophets and the writings, which is Nevi'im and Ketuvim. Finally, there are laws of the rabbis, and these are called midrabanan. In Aramaic, that means from the rabbis. Throughout the Mishnah and the Gemara, the Talmud itself, the rabbis argue as to whether a law is from the Torah and comes directly from God, or whether it is a rabbinic decree. Often the rabbinic laws surround a Torah law to make certain that it's not violated. There's not total agreement among the rabbis. For instance, while there is general agreement that there are 613 commandments in the Torah, 248 positive and 365 negative commandments, it's not total agreement, it's general agreement. There are multiple lists by different rabbis enumerating those very mitzvot differently. It's fascinating, isn't it? Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.